He stepped into the wrong elevator on the worst morning of his life. And the woman sitting in that wheelchair hadn't just broken his heart 8 years ago. She was the reason he'd buried his name, his career, and every dream he'd ever built. Now she was staring at him like she'd seen a ghost. And maybe she had. Because the man the world believed had betrayed her company, stolen from it, lied to it, destroyed it from the inside, was standing 3 feet away in a maintenance uniform, holding a little girl's drawing, with grease on his hands and tears he refused to let fall. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The elevator doors slid shut behind him, with a sound like a verdict. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where the truth doesn't arrive on time, where good people suffer quietly for years before anyone notices, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button if you believe people deserve second chances. And drop a comment right now telling us your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Let's begin. The morning started the way all of Miles Carter's mornings started, badly and without warning. His alarm went off at 5:15, which was technically unnecessary because Ava had climbed into his bed sometime around 4 and spent the next hour pressing her small cold feet against his legs like she was trying to warm them on a radiator. He didn't move her. He never did. Instead, he lay there in the gray, pre-dawn dark of their apartment on Kellner Street, listening to the building's old pipes knock and hiss, watching the ceiling the way a man watches something that has nothing to offer but is still better than closing his eyes. He had a lot of ceilings like that in his life. By 5:30, he was in the kitchen. The coffee maker was broken again, a slow drip from the cracked carafe that he'd been managing with a well-placed dish towel for 3 weeks. So he made instant with water heated in a saucepan and drank it standing at the counter while Ava's drawings rustled on the refrigerator from the draft under the front door. She drew the same things over and over: houses with triangle roofs, stick figures holding hands, buildings that looked like they were stretching towards something just out of frame. She was 6 years old, and she already drew like someone who understood that the world was taller than she could reach. He didn't own a car. He took the 6:10 bus, and if the 6:10 was late, which it was, 2 or 3 times a week, because it was January and the city's transit authority treated winter like a personal inconvenience rather than a seasonal certainty. Then he jogged the last 7 blocks to Sterling Medical Center and clocked in sweating through his uniform and still somehow 3 minutes early, which was the only small vanity he permitted himself. Sterling Medical wasn't where he'd imagined spending his 30s, but very little about his life was what he'd imagined, so he'd stopped keeping score. His job title was Maintenance Technician, Grade 2, which meant he fixed things. HVAC units, medical refrigeration systems, backup generators, elevator control panels, the ancient pneumatic tube network in the East Wing that transported lab specimens and that everyone under 40 assumed was decorative. He was good at it, quietly, unremarkably good at it, in the way that meant no one ever mentioned it unless something broke and he wasn't there. He didn't mind. He'd learned to exist in the space between noticed and invisible, and he'd gotten comfortable there. The thing about working at a hospital was that you understood, on some cellular level, that every person in the building was carrying something they couldn't set down. The patients, obviously, but also the nurses on hour 11 of a 12-hour shift. The resident who kept her grief face on like a mask that had fused to her skin. The family members in waiting rooms who had stopped checking their phones because they'd learned that news, when it came, wouldn't come through a screen. Miles moved through all of that every day with his tool bag and his work orders, and he'd learned to be quiet around pain because quiet was the only useful thing he had to offer. He also moved through it with a secret. Not a dramatic one, not by the world's standards. No one was chasing him. There were no cameras on his back. The secret was just this. Every dollar he made, every hour of overtime, every weekend shift, every holiday he volunteered for because the differential paid out at time and a half, went toward Ava. Her speech therapy sessions at the Brennan Language Center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Her specialized preschool program with teachers trained in deaf education, which cost more per month than his rent. The upgraded hearing technology her audiologist had recommended 6 months ago that insurance covered exactly 40% of, which Miles was handling the rest of, with a payment plan he'd negotiated himself by calling the billing office 4 times and refusing to be transferred to voicemail. None of this was heroic. He was just her father, and she needed things, and so he provided them. That was the entire architecture of his life. He didn't talk about it at work. He didn't talk about much at work, actually, beyond the functional. The condenser unit on 7 is throwing a pressure fault again. The freight elevator's acting up. The backup generator in the East Wing needs a full inspection before Thursday's accreditation review. His coworkers liked him well enough. Darnell from the overnight crew sometimes left coffee for him at the shift handoff point, which was its own language for, "You look like you need this, and I'm not going to make a thing of it." He appreciated that. The morning it happened started like all the others. He'd been called in early, not for anything dramatic, just a refrigeration unit on the 6th floor that was cycling irregularly and needed recalibration before the pharmacy opened. He finished it by 7:40, signed off the work order, and was making his way back to the service elevator when his phone buzzed in his chest pocket. He almost didn't check it. He was thinking about the condenser fault on 7, whether it was the capacitor or the relay, running the diagnostic sequence in his head. But the buzz came twice in quick succession, which was the pattern he'd set specifically for the Brennan Center, because they were instructed to send double notifications if Ava needed him immediately. He stopped in the corridor and looked at the screen. "Mr. Carter, please call the center as soon as possible. Ava had a brief episode during her session this morning. She is stable and with our staff, but we'd like to speak with you urgently." The walls of the corridor didn't change. The overhead fluorescents kept their flat, indifferent hum. Somewhere behind a closed door, a monitor beeped its slow rhythm. Everything stayed exactly where it was, and Miles felt the floor do something complicated under his feet that wasn't actually happening. Brief episode. Stable. He called. The session coordinator, a woman named Renata, who had always been steady with him, who had never once embellished or minimized, told him calmly that Ava had become dizzy during a listening exercise, had briefly lost consciousness, had come back within 30 seconds, was now sitting up, was asking for him in her signs, was fine, but that the center's protocol required a parent to come in and that they were recommending an evaluation at their affiliated hospital just to be safe. "Which hospital?" Miles said. "Sterling Medical," Renata said. "Their pediatric neurology department." He was already in Sterling Medical. He told her he was on his way, hung up, and moved. The problem was geography. Ava's intake would be through the pediatric wing, which was on the opposite side of the building from the service corridor he was currently standing in. The fastest route cut through the main building and then up. But the main elevator bank closest to him was the executive rehabilitation floor elevator, which technically required a staff badge to access above the 3rd floor. And Miles's badge was a general maintenance credential that had clearance everywhere except the executive floors, which he'd never had reason to go to. He hit the button anyway. The doors opened. He stepped in, pressed the lobby button to cross-navigate to the main pediatric wing bank, and the elevator went up instead of down. He pressed the button again. The elevator ignored him with the serene indifference of machines that have made up their minds, and the floor indicator climbed, 4, 5, 6, and then settled with a soft chime at 7. The executive rehabilitation floor. The doors opened. The hallway was different up here, quieter. Better lit, the fluorescence replaced with something warmer. The floors were the same industrial tile, but cleaner, or maybe just less trafficked. There was a nurse's station to the right and a long corridor to the left, and directly in front of him, positioned in the doorway of a room as though she'd been placed there by someone setting a scene, a woman in a wheelchair. She was young, early 30s maybe. Dark hair pulled back with the efficient carelessness of someone who'd stopped thinking about it. She wore a fitted blazer over a light gray shirt, and there was a tablet in her lap. And she had the posture of a person who had spent years in rooms where posture mattered. Even in the chair, she carried herself like someone who was used to being the tallest person at any table. Miles's brain ran the recognition process the way it always did. Automatic, fast, peripheral, and then it ran it again, and then it stopped running entirely. He knew that face. He knew it the way you know a piece of music you haven't heard in years. Not consciously, not retrievably, but somewhere below the machinery of thought, somewhere the body stores what the mind tries to release. He knew the particular line of her jaw, and the way her chin lifted slightly when she was concentrating on something. He knew the small scar near her left temple that she'd gotten from a car door in college. He knew the way her eyes moved, sharp, lateral, taking inventory of the room the instant she became aware that the room had changed. Her eyes found him. Evelyn Hart had been 22 years old the last time Miles Carter had looked at her. She'd been standing in the parking garage of the Meridian Tower in downtown Chicago, and she'd said, "I never want to see you again," and she'd meant it, and he hadn't argued with her because at the time the evidence against him had been so clean, so thoroughly constructed, that arguing would have required a vocabulary he didn't have. That was 8 years ago. She looked different. Of course she did. Everyone did after 8 years, and she had clearly lived through something the outline hadn't prepared him for. But the thing that stopped him wasn't the wheelchair or the changed shape of her face, or even the fact that she was here, in his hospital, on a floor he'd never had reason to visit. It was her expression. It wasn't rage. It wasn't the cold professional neutrality he might have expected from a woman who'd built an empire partly out of controlled contempt for the person who'd supposedly wronged her. It was, for one unguarded second, before everything else moved in to manage it. It was something that looked almost like recognition. And underneath that, something that looked almost like grief. The second lasted about as long as seconds do. Then her face closed. "You," she said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, which was the kind of detail that made no sense to notice and was nevertheless completely impossible to ignore. "I got in the wrong elevator," Miles said. "Clearly." A nurse appeared at his elbow. Young, a little startled, badge reading Patricia Osei, RN, and Miles held up his maintenance badge with the practiced ease of a man who has spent a decade explaining his presence in places where he didn't quite fit. "Took the wrong bank. I'm trying to get to pediatric." Nurse Osei looked at his badge, looked at Evelyn, looked at Miles. "The main bank is back through the lobby level. You'll need to—" "I know," Miles said. "I'm sorry to interrupt." He didn't look at Evelyn again. He pressed the elevator button, stood with his back to the hallway, and waited with the specific stillness of a man performing composure rather than feeling it. His phone was in his hand. Renata's number was still on the screen. Ava was somewhere in this building, dizzy and confused and signing for him, and that was the only thing that mattered. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. The doors closed. He leaned against the back wall of the elevator car and pressed his palm flat against the cold metal panel and made himself breathe the way he'd learned to breathe years ago when he'd understood that falling apart was a thing he could no longer afford. Ava was sitting on an exam table in pediatric intake, wrapped in a hospital blanket that was about 3 times too big for her, wearing the expression of a 6-year-old who has correctly identified that she is the center of a lot of adult concern and is experiencing this fact with ambivalent pride. She had her sketchbook in her lap. When Miles came through the curtain, she looked up and her whole face rearranged itself. She signed, "You came fast." "I'm always fast for you," Miles said out loud, and signed it simultaneously, which he'd been practicing for a year and still didn't do as smoothly as she deserved. He sat on the edge of the exam table beside her, and she leaned against his arm immediately, the sketchbook pressing into his ribs. The attending physician, Dr. Yemi Okafor, pediatric neurology, who had the quiet authority of someone who delivered difficult news for a living and had therefore learned to anchor people before he said anything significant, came in about 10 minutes later. He was thorough. He asked Ava questions through Miles, who translated, and he watched how she responded, and he ordered an EEG and a full blood panel and an MRI, which he described as precautionary, which Miles knew meant he wasn't ready to rule anything out. "Has she had episodes like this before?" Dr. Okafor asked. "Small ones," Miles said. "She gets dizzy sometimes. The audiologist thought it might be connected to her inner ear, but she's never lost consciousness." "Okay." Dr. Okafor wrote something down. "We're going to keep her for observation for the afternoon. The test should give us a clearer picture." Miles nodded. He understood the information. He processed it the way he processed most things, by sorting it into the category of things he could not currently fix and then continuing to function anyway. He texted his supervisor, Carl, to explain the situation. Carl responded in 9 minutes with, "Take whatever time you need, we'll cover the floor," which was the kind of thing Carl said, and then spent the next 3 weeks quietly resenting. But Miles would deal with that when it became a problem. He sat with Ava while they waited. She showed him her sketchbook. New drawings from therapy, a girl with lines radiating from her ears like music made visible, a building with roots growing under it into the ground, a small figure sitting at the top of a very tall staircase with something in her hands that might have been a kite or might have been a question mark. "What's this one?" Miles asked, pointing. Ava signed "A girl who can hear everything now." Then she reconsidered and changed the sign to "almost everything." Almost everything's pretty good, Miles said. She shrugged with one shoulder in the specific way she had that meant, I know, but I want more, which was a quality he recognized because he'd watched her get it from him without ever meaning to teach it. The afternoon moved the way hospital afternoons move. Slowly, in increments measured by shift changes and the wheeled passage of equipment carts and the particular silence of corridors that have learned to absorb distress as a professional function. Miles went to the vending machine twice, once for Ava and once for himself, and ate his crackers standing in the hallway because Ava had taken over the entire exam table with her drawings, and he hadn't wanted to disturb the arrangement. I was on his way back from the second trip when he rounded the corridor corner and nearly walked directly into a wheelchair. Evelyn Hart looked up at him from a distance of approximately 4 feet. She was alone this time. No nurse, no aide, no buffer of institutional propriety. Just her and the chair and the tablet she'd apparently been using, which was now face down in her lap, as though she'd set it there when she heard him coming. Mr. Carter, she said. He hadn't heard her call him Mr. Carter in his life. It landed with the particular awkwardness of a title used as a distance-keeping mechanism between people who once knew each other's middle names. Ms. Hart, he said, because two could do that. A pause stretched between them. Not comfortable, not dramatic, just long. The kind that accumulates when two people have too much to say and neither of them is willing to go first because whoever goes first is already losing something. I didn't know you worked here, she finally said. 8 years, Miles said. Maintenance. Something moved across her face that he couldn't read cleanly. Not pity. He'd been watching for pity for 8 years and had gotten good at identifying it. Something more complicated than that. Are you here for someone? She asked. My daughter, he said. She's 6. She had an episode in her speech therapy session this morning. He didn't know why he was telling her this. He didn't know why he was still standing in this hallway. They're running tests. Evelyn's expression shifted again, this time toward something less guarded. Is she? They think so. They don't know yet. Another pause. I didn't know you had a daughter, Evelyn said. There's a lot of things we didn't get to know about each other, Miles said, and it came out flatter than he intended, without edge but also without warmth, which was approximately where he'd landed emotionally after a day that had included a broken carafe, a wrong elevator, and now this. Evelyn looked at her hands. They were still on the wheels of the chair, still, as if she was holding the chair in place, or the chair was holding her. Miles, I should get back to her, he said. She doesn't like to be alone in unfamiliar places. He walked around the wheelchair with enough space that neither of them had to negotiate the gap. He didn't look back. He went back through the corridor, through the curtain, back to Ava, who was still drawing, who looked up when he came in with the total and absolute relief of a child who has been waiting for the one specific person who makes the room feel like something other than a room. He sat beside her. She signed everything okay? He signed back yes, which wasn't entirely true, but it was the truest thing he had that she needed to hear right now. Outside the curtain, the corridor went on doing what corridors do. Somewhere above them on the 7th floor, Evelyn Hart sat alone with her tablet and the particular weight of whatever she was carrying, and Miles did not think about that. He looked at his daughter's drawings instead, the buildings with roots, the girl who could almost hear everything. And he sat very still, and he waited for whatever the tests would say. The EEG came back that evening with a result that Dr. Okafor described as within normal range but worth monitoring, which was the kind of medical phrasing that answered one question and quietly opened 3 more. The MRI showed nothing structural. The blood panel flagged a mild iron deficiency, which the doctor said could contribute to dizziness and fatigue, and which Miles filed immediately into the category of things he could actually fix. Iron-rich foods, a supplement, a call to her pediatrician to adjust the routine. Something concrete. Something with a solution at the end of it. They let Ava go home at 7:15. She fell asleep on the bus with her head against Miles's arm and her sketchbook still clutched in both hands, and he spent the 40-minute ride home looking out the window at the city moving past in the dark. The lit storefronts, the figures hunched into their coats against the cold, the slow churn of a January night that didn't particularly care what kind of day anyone had survived. He carried Ava up the stairs to their apartment because the elevator in their building was the kind that worked approximately 2/3 of the time, and tonight he didn't feel like finding out which third this was. He put her in her bed, tucked the blanket around her with the specific thoroughness of someone performing an act. They've performed so many times it has become a kind of prayer. Not dramatic, not consciously tender, just a man pulling a blanket to his daughter's chin in the dark, because that was the next right thing. Then he sat at the kitchen table for a long time without turning on the light. He didn't think about Evelyn. He was deliberate about that, the same way you're deliberate about not pressing a bruise. Not because you've forgotten it's there, but because you already know exactly how much it hurts. He thought about the iron supplement and the audiologist appointment he needed to reschedule, and whether the grocery store 2 blocks over carried the dark leafy greens that Dr. Okafor had mentioned, and whether he could rearrange his Thursday shift to get Ava to her speech session without pulling from the emergency fund he'd been slowly rebuilding over the past 8 months. This was what his life looked like from the inside. Not noble, not cinematic, just a man sitting in an unlit kitchen running the arithmetic of keeping one small person afloat and doing it badly enough to be human and well enough to still be here. He went to sleep at 10:30. He was back at Sterling by 6:15 the next morning. But Evelyn Hart, meanwhile, did not sleep. This was not unusual. Since the accident, 14 months ago now, a Tuesday in November, wet road, a vehicle whose behavior in that instant had never been fully or satisfactorily explained to her. Sleep had become something she negotiated with rather than entered. She'd lie in the dark of her room on the 7th floor, which was a private rehabilitation suite that her board of directors had arranged, and which she'd accepted without argument, because arguing about rooms was a fight she didn't have the energy for when she was fighting everything else, and she'd run through the day's documents in her head. Operational reports, quarterly projections, personnel decisions. The kind of work that required something from her brain without asking anything from her body, which was the balance she'd settled into. But that night, the documents wouldn't come. What came instead was Miles Carter's face in that elevator, the two of them staring at each other across the space of 8 years and whatever had happened inside them during those years. And the particular flatness in his voice when he'd said, "There's a lot of things we didn't get to know about each other." Not bitter. That was the thing that stayed with her. She'd been braced for bitterness, had been bracing for it since the elevator doors opened, and she'd seen him standing there in that uniform, with that tool bag, looking exactly like a man who had been quietly surviving something for a very long time. She'd expected anger underneath the surface, and what she'd found instead was just nothing, not emptiness. Something more like a careful absence, like a room where someone has removed everything breakable. She picked up her tablet from the nightstand and opened the Heart Biotech internal archive. She wasn't sure afterward what she'd been looking for. She told herself it was routine. She reviewed old records regularly, had made it a practice since taking over full executive authority at 26, because she believed that companies accumulated their real character in the documents no one looked at twice. Board minutes from unremarkable quarters. Compliance filings. Personnel records from departments that didn't report to the C-suite. The archaeology of how decisions actually got made, as opposed to how they got described in the quarterly earnings call. She went to the archive from 8 years ago because that was where her mind had already gone. She told herself it was just to close the loop, to confirm what she already knew, to put the file back in its drawer and get on with the work of not thinking about Miles Carter standing in her hallway, looking like he'd walked through a wall that had been there so long he'd stopped seeing it as unusual. The archive loaded slowly on the tablet's interface, old formatting, legacy file structure, the kind of digital archaeology that required patience. She started with the project files from the Autonomous Mobility Division, which had been the center of the controversy 8 years ago. The project that Miles had supposedly sabotaged, the proprietary software he'd allegedly stolen, the competitor he'd allegedly sold it to, the evidence that had been, by all accounts, thorough and unambiguous. She read for 3 hours. By 2 in the morning, something in her chest had gone very quiet in the way that things go quiet right before they break. The files weren't organized the way she remembered being told they were. She'd been 22 when everything happened, young enough to have taken the summary she was given and accepted it as the whole document. She'd been grieving, too, in the way you grieve something you didn't know you'd lost until it was already gone. She hadn't gone looking for contradictions because she hadn't believed there were any to find. There were contradictions. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that announce themselves. Small procedural inconsistencies. Timestamps that didn't align with the investigation timeline she'd been shown. An internal safety report filed under Miles's employee ID 6 weeks before the allegations surfaced, a report flagging critical instability in the autonomous vehicle software's lane decision algorithm under wet road conditions. A report that, according to the archive metadata, had been received, logged, and then routed to a subdirectory labeled Resolved, with a closure note signed by the division's executive director. The executive director at the time had been Gerald Marsh. Gerald Marsh, who had been her mentor since she was 19 years old, who had guided her through the early years of Heart Biotech after her parents stepped back from active management, who had sat in the front row at every major company announcement she'd made, and who still occupied a senior advisory role on the board. Gerald Marsh, who had personally walked her through the evidence against Miles 8 years ago and held her hand, metaphorically, while she'd done what she'd believed was the right thing and cut Miles Carter out of her life, with the clean efficiency of a woman who had been taught, by Gerald Marsh, that sentiment was a liability in business. She set the tablet down on the nightstand. She picked it up again. She went back to the safety report and read every word of it twice, and then she read the closure note, and then she sat in the dark of her rehabilitation suite on the 7th floor of Sterling Medical Center, 14 months post-accident, 6 weeks post-discharge from acute care, 2 floors above the maintenance corridor where Miles Carter worked 6 days a week, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't even realized had been sealed. She didn't say anything to anyone. Not yet. That was the thing about Evelyn Hart that people who worked for her understood, and people who only knew her professionally sometimes misread as coldness. She didn't move until she was certain. She had learned this the hard way, by watching what happened when people with power moved on incomplete information, and she had taken the lesson to heart with the thoroughness of someone who intended never to make the same mistake twice. She would gather everything first, all of it, and then she would decide. So she said nothing, and she watched, and she worked. Over the following 2 weeks, she used her clearance as CEO to access financial records she'd never had reason to look at before. The Rehabilitation Research Fund, a small, irregularly structured account that processed anonymous donations for experimental treatment programs. It had been running for 7 years. The contributions came in once a year, always in January, always in a similar range, always anonymous. Routed through a third-party processing system that the hospital's development office had long since stopped questioning because the money was legitimate and the paperwork was clean, and nobody turns away legitimate paperwork with clean money. She had the hospital's financial director pull the originating account information. It took him 4 days to get it through the proper channels because Evelyn insisted on doing it properly, through the hospital's legal office, with documentation at every step, because she wasn't going to give anyone a reason to question the process later. The account was registered to a personal banking institution in the city. The name on the account was Miles D. Carter. She sat with that information for a long time, 7 years, every January. The amounts weren't enormous, not by the scale that Heart Biotech operated on, not by the scale that Evelyn's personal finances operated on, but they were not small amounts for a man working a maintenance job and raising a deaf child alone. They were the amounts of a man who had looked at what he had and calculated, with the specific precision of an engineer, exactly how much he could give away without crossing the line into not being able to function. He had been paying for her experimental treatments. For 7 years. While she believed he'd betrayed her company, stolen from her, lied to her, destroyed something she'd trusted him with. While she'd built a version of the past that required him to be the villain because it was the only version that made sense of everything she'd lost. He had been, every January, finding a way to keep her from getting worse. Evelyn put the financial report on her desk and placed her hands flat on either side of it and breathed carefully for a while. She had a board meeting in 40 minutes. She would go to it. She would run it with the same controlled precision she brought to every board meeting because the company needed her to do that, and because falling apart in front of the board was not a thing she was willing to do under any circumstances. She would deal with what she was feeling later, in the dark, the way she dealt with most things that were too large for daylight. But first she sent a message to her personal assistant, a young man named Tom, who had been with her for 3 years and who had learned the difference between a request and an instruction. Find out everything you can about a Heart Biotech employee from 8 years ago named Miles Carter. Engineering Division. I want whatever's in our HR archive, whatever's in the legal files from his termination, and anything from the Autonomous Mobility Project that hasn't been formally archived under the Resolved subdirectory. Send it to my personal encrypted account, not the corporate one. Tom's response came back in 11 minutes. Understood. I'll have what I can find by end of week. Miles, for his part, spent those 2 weeks doing what he always did, working, taking care of Ava, not thinking about Evelyn Hart. He was getting better at 2 out of 3. Ava's follow-up appointment confirmed the iron deficiency as the likely culprit for the episode. Her pediatrician adjusted her diet plan and added a supplement and told Miles that kids with her condition sometimes ran low without obvious symptoms and that they'd caught it early enough that it wasn't going to become a problem as long as they stayed on top of it. Miles thanked her, asked 4 specific follow-up questions, wrote the answers down in the small notebook he kept in his chest pocket for exactly this purpose, and paid the copay with a card he'd been carefully keeping under its limit. He ran into Evelyn twice more in those 2 weeks, both times by accident. Once in the hospital cafeteria when he'd come down for a late lunch, and she was there with a physical therapist, working through what looked like an upper body session at one of the accessible tables. And once in the East Wing corridor near the pneumatic tube station where he'd been replacing a valve housing and she'd come through on her way to some appointment or other. Both times they acknowledged each other with the specific minimal civility of people who have agreed without discussing it on the terms of their temporary coexistence. A nod. A brief pause. Nothing that required either of them to put words around what was sitting in the room between them. He noticed, though, the second time, in the corridor, that she looked tired in a way that was different from the tired of rehabilitation. She looked like someone who'd been up for hours running something in her head and hadn't finished running it yet. He recognized the look because he saw it in his bathroom mirror with some regularity. He didn't say anything. It wasn't his place. Whatever Evelyn Hart was running in her head was her own business, and Miles Carter was nobody's obligation to notice. He went back to the valve housing and finished the job. Tom delivered the files on a Friday afternoon, and Evelyn read them over the weekend. It was worse than she'd thought. Not in the melodramatic sense of things being worse than expected. She'd been preparing herself for a significant revision of the past, and she'd built some psychological scaffolding around that. It was worse because it was so deliberate. Every document in Miles's termination file had been constructed with a precision that would have looked impeccable to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for the seams. The evidence of theft was thorough and internally consistent and chronologically airtight, which was exactly what evidence looked like when someone with resources and time had built it from the outside in rather than discovered it from the inside out. Miles's safety report, the one flagging the lane decision algorithm failure, had been filed on a Thursday. The following Monday, a formal complaint had been lodged against him by an anonymous source within the engineering division, alleging that Miles had been copying proprietary code to an external drive. By Wednesday, Gerald Marsh had convened a preliminary investigation. By the following Friday, Miles had been escorted from the building. 8 days. From safety report to termination, 8 days. The proprietary code that Miles had allegedly stolen was, according to the investigation files, the same code that governed the autonomous vehicle software's safety parameters. The same software whose failures he'd flagged in the report that had been routed to resolved before anyone with authority to act on it had seen it. There was also a non-disclosure agreement in the file. It was 47 pages long, drafted by Hart Biotech's legal team, and it had been signed by Miles Carter, under conditions that the file described as voluntary, and that Evelyn, reading the circumstances around the signing, understood to mean, sign this or we pursue criminal charges and you lose everything. He'd signed it. He'd signed it, and he'd disappeared, and Gerald Marsh had taken the safety discoveries Miles had documented, repackaged them under a different methodology, and presented them 18 months later at an industry conference as original research, for which he'd received a professional ethics commendation from the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Consortium. Evelyn closed the tablet. She looked at the window of her rehabilitation suite, the January sky outside, gray and flat, the kind of sky that committed fully to its own bleakness, without apology. She thought about something Miles had said in the corridor. There's a lot of things we didn't get to know about each other. She had taken it at the time as a kind of deflection, a way of acknowledging their history without reopening it. Now she understood it differently. He hadn't been deflecting. He'd been saying something accurate. He hadn't known that she was still piecing together what had actually happened. She hadn't known that he'd been paying for her treatments for 7 years. They'd been living in adjacent ignorances, a few floors apart in the same building, each of them carrying a version of the past that the other one could have corrected, if either of them had known there was something to correct. She picked up her phone and called Tom. "I need you to arrange something for me," she said, quietly. "No board notification, no press office involvement, nothing formal. I want to talk to the hospital's legal counsel, privately, and I want access to Gerald Marsh's executive communications archive from the past 10 years. Tom was quiet for a moment. "That's going to raise questions," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Let me handle the questions. Just get me the access." "Understood," Tom said, and she could hear in his voice that he understood more than the instruction, that he was filing something away, adjusting his map of what was happening. I was good at that. It was why she'd kept him. She hung up and sat with her hands in her lap for a while, looking at nothing in particular. Outside the window, the sky hadn't changed. The city moved at its own pace, indifferent and continuous. She thought about a lane decision algorithm failing on a wet road in November. She thought about a report filed on a Thursday and buried by the following Monday. She thought about 14 months of rehabilitation and the particular loneliness of rebuilding a life that your body had fundamentally restructured without your input. She thought about Miles Carter sitting in an unlit corridor with his phone in his hand, reading a message about his daughter, and getting on the wrong elevator. She thought about how much of what had happened to both of them might have been different if one document had been read by the right person at the right time. She didn't call Miles. She wasn't ready for that yet. She didn't have the full picture, and she wasn't going to go to him with a partial one. She owed him more than a partial picture. She owed him something she couldn't yet calculate, but she was working on it, and she would work on it correctly, or she wouldn't work on it at all. On the other side of the hospital, Miles was replacing the control board on a freight elevator that had been throwing intermittent errors for 3 weeks. It was the kind of job that required full attention. The panel was old, the wiring diagram was partially illegible from water damage, and the only way to do it right was to trace every circuit by hand and verify each connection before moving to the next. He liked this kind of work, actually, not because it was satisfying in some elevated sense, but because it was honest. The circuit either worked or it didn't. The connection was clean or it wasn't. There was no version of the work that looked right but wasn't. No way to construct a false positive from a bad connection and make it hold. Either the elevator ran or it didn't. He'd been thinking, lately, in the spaces between tasks, about Ava's drawing of the building with roots. He didn't know what she'd meant by it exactly. She was 6, the specific symbolism was probably not the point. But he kept coming back to the image. A structure that looked stable from the outside because of what was happening underground. Invisible, unremarked. The roots doing work that the building got credit for. He finished the control board at 4:30, ran a test sequence, rode the elevator through 3 full cycles to confirm it was clean. It was. He signed off on the work order, packed his tools, and made his way to the locker room to change. Darnell was at the sink, washing his hands before heading into the overnight shift. He glanced at Miles in the mirror. "You look like someone who hasn't slept since Tuesday." "Wednesday," Miles said. "Close enough." Darnell dried his hands. "Everything okay with the kid?" "Follow-up was fine. Iron deficiency. They caught it." "Good." Darnell said it simply, without making it into anything, which was what Miles valued most about Darnell's particular form of friendship. "My wife's kid had the same thing around that age. Couple months of spinach and they're fine." That's basically what the doctor said. "Doctors are catching up to mothers," Darnell said, and headed for the door. "Get some sleep, Carter." Miles changed out of his uniform, stowed his tool bag, and stood at his locker for a moment longer than necessary. Just standing. Not thinking, specifically. Not about Ava's tests, not about the freight elevator's clean circuit, not about Evelyn Hart reading documents in the dark on the 7th floor, building something from them that he had no way to see yet and no reason to expect. He closed the locker. He went to catch his bus. The city was doing its January thing, cold and flat and continuous, the streets already going dark at 5 o'clock, people moving fast with their heads down against the wind coming off the lake. Miles walked with his hands in his pockets and his collar up, and he thought about what to make for dinner and whether the grocery store would still have the spinach, and whether Ava's speech session on Thursday would run long enough to need a pickup rather than a pickup and wait, and all of it was ordinary and all of it was his, and he held on to it the way you hold on to ordinary things when you have learned, through specific and irreversible experience, that they are not guaranteed. He didn't know what Evelyn had found. He didn't know what she was building from it. He didn't know that somewhere in the hospital he'd just left, a woman was sitting with a document that had the power to change everything he believed about the worst years of his life. He got on the bus. He found a seat by the window. He watched the city go past in the dark. And somewhere above him, unseen, the work of uncovering what had actually happened was already underway. Tom delivered Gerald Marsh's communications archive on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Evelyn had requested it. It arrived as an encrypted file transfer, 43 gigabytes of emails, internal memos, calendar records, and flagged communications spanning a decade of executive activity. Evelyn's legal counsel, a careful woman named Sandra Reeves, who had been with Heart Biotech for 11 years and who had the specific quality of being thorough without being theatrical, sat with Evelyn for 2 hours going through the access protocols, explaining what they could use, what required additional authorization, and what the legal exposure looked like if they were wrong about what they suspected. "If what you're telling me is in there," Sandra said, setting her coffee down on the side table with the deliberateness of someone choosing their words at the same rate, "then we're not looking at an internal HR matter. We're looking at something that goes to federal regulators." "I know," Evelyn said. "And if we start pulling that thread and it doesn't hold, it'll hold," Evelyn said. Not arrogant, just certain, the way you're certain about things you've read 4 times at 2 in the morning when you couldn't sleep. Sandra looked at her for a moment. "Okay," she said, "then we do this correctly. Everything documented, every step logged. We don't give anyone a reason to question the process." "That's exactly what I want," Evelyn said. "Start with the communications between Marsh and the engineering division in the 3 months before Miles Carter's termination." Sandra opened her laptop, and Evelyn wheeled to the window and looked at the February sky, which was the same gray it had been since January, and showed no particular signs of changing its position on the matter. Below, the hospital's main entrance moved its steady traffic of arrivals and departures. People coming in carrying things they hoped to leave behind. People leaving with things they hadn't arrived with. She had been watching that entrance from this window for 14 months, and she still hadn't gotten used to the specific quality of that exchange. The work took 11 days. Sandra brought in 2 associates from Heart Biotech's external legal firm, both of them sworn to confidentiality under agreements Sandra drafted personally. They worked from Evelyn's suite, which had a second room that functioned as a sitting area and that now functioned as a document review space, with printed materials and banker's boxes and a second monitor set up on the coffee table. Evelyn was present for most of it, not because she needed to supervise, but because she couldn't make herself stay away. She read over shoulders and asked questions, and occasionally went quiet for long stretches when something in a document landed in a way that required her to breathe through it before she could continue. What they found was not subtle, once you knew where to look. Gerald Marsh had received Miles' safety report on the lane decision algorithm the same day it was filed. His response, sent to the division's technology director within the hour, was 4 sentences. "Hold this. Don't circulate. We'll address internally. I'll be in touch." The technology director's reply was 2 words: understood, deleted. The original report remained in the archive only because it had been autologged by the filing system before Marsh's instruction came through, a small bureaucratic accident that had, apparently, been overlooked. The anonymous complaint against Miles, filed 4 days later, had been submitted through an internal ethics portal that was supposed to guarantee source anonymity. Heart Biotech's IT infrastructure, however, maintained a back-end log of portal submissions that was accessible to senior executives. Marsh had accessed that log the same day the complaint was filed. The submission IP address matched a workstation registered to one of Marsh's direct reports. A man named Kevin Stroud, who had left the company 6 years ago, and who was, according to Tom's preliminary research, currently working in a consulting capacity for a competitor firm in which Marsh held a silent financial interest. The evidence of code theft, the core of the case against Miles, had been constructed from a combination of genuine file access logs and fabricated transfer records. The genuine logs showed Miles doing exactly what engineers did, accessing code he was authorized to access, working on components that were within his project scope. The fabricated transfer records showed those files moving to an external drive that, according to the original investigation, had never been recovered. There was no chain of custody for the external drive. There was no forensic analysis. There was a declaration from Marsh that the drive had existed and that its disappearance constituted evidence of intentional destruction, which the investigation had accepted without verification because Marsh was the investigation's supervising executive. Sandra set the relevant documents in a row on the coffee table one afternoon and looked at them with the expression of someone who had suspected the shape of something and was now looking at the actual shape. "He built in 8 days," she said. "The whole structure. 8 days." "He had the resources," Evelyn said, "and he had leverage. Miles had signed employment contracts with arbitration clauses that limited his options. And he was—" She stopped. "He was 24. He didn't have anyone helping him read the paperwork." Sandra looked at her. "You were 22. "I know what I was," Evelyn said. There was a pause. "The NDA," Sandra said carefully. "The conditions under which it was signed were coercive," Evelyn said. "I've already talked to outside counsel about that. We can have it voided. Miles's attorney, if he gets one, will be able to establish duress without much difficulty once the investigation record is visible." "His attorney," Sandra repeated. "You've thought about what you're going to say to him." "Not yet," Evelyn said, which was true in the narrow sense. She hadn't rehearsed a conversation, hadn't drafted language, hadn't prepared anything that resembled a script. But she'd been thinking about Miles Carter in the unmanaged hours of most nights for 3 weeks, and what she'd been thinking was not yet something she could put into words that didn't feel inadequate. She picked up one of the documents, the technology director's reply to Marsh. Understood. Deleted. 2 words. She looked at them for a moment and then set the document back down. "The accident," she said. "The November accident. What does the archive say about the vehicle systems review that was conducted afterward?" Sandra hesitated. "There's a review report filed by the Autonomous Mobility Division 3 months after the accident. It concludes that the vehicle's systems performed within design parameters and that road conditions were the primary contributing factor." "Who signed off on the review?" "Gerald Marsh." Evelyn nodded once. She had expected this, had been building toward it in her head for days. But expecting something and having it confirmed were different experiences, and for a moment the room felt slightly smaller than it had before. "I want an independent forensic analysis of the accident vehicle's system data," she said. "Whatever was preserved from the incident investigation. I want it done by an external engineering firm with no prior relationship to Heart Biotech, and I want it done before we move on Marsh." "That could take weeks," Sandra said. "Then it takes weeks," Evelyn said. "We do this right, or we don't do it." Miles found out something was happening, not because anyone told him, but because of the way the 7th floor changed. He didn't have reason to go up there regularly. The executive rehabilitation suite had its own dedicated maintenance staff for most routine matters, and Miles's work orders rarely pulled him above the 5th floor. But in late February, a recurring issue with the building's central HVAC manifold required him to access a control junction that happened to be located in a utility room adjacent to the executive corridor. And over the course of 3 separate visits, he noticed that Evelyn Hart's suite had acquired, in sequence, a second monitor visible through the partially open door, a set of banker's boxes stacked in the hallway outside with a hand-lettered confidentiality notice taped to each one, and a revolving cast of people in business attire who moved with the specific purposeful urgency of people doing work they couldn't discuss in elevators. He didn't ask about it. It wasn't his business, and more to the point, whatever Evelyn was working on was operating at an altitude so far above his daily geography that it might as well have been occurring in a different building. He focused on his own things. Ava's Thursday speech session had gone well, better than well, according to her therapist, a woman named Dr. Kowalski, who had been working with her for 14 months and who had a gift for delivering progress reports in a way that felt real rather than performed. Ava had made a breakthrough with a cluster of consonant sounds that had been giving her trouble since October, and Dr. Kowalski had shown Miles a recording of the session's final exercise. Ava's voice finding the shape of words it had been reaching for, still imperfect, still effortful, but there, genuinely there, in a way that made Miles have to look at the ceiling for a second before he could respond. "She works hard," Dr. Kowalski said. "Yeah," Miles said, "she does." He didn't say that Ava came by it honestly. He wasn't given to that kind of statement. But he thought it. He thought about it on the bus home, and while he was making dinner, and later while he was sitting on the floor of Ava's room after she'd fallen asleep, doing nothing in particular except existing in the same space as his daughter, which was a thing he did sometimes when the day had been a lot, and proximity was the only remedy he had available. He didn't know that 50 feet above him, in a utility room he'd visited 3 times that week, the HVAC control junction he'd serviced was running clean and quiet, and that on the other side of the wall, Sandra Reeves was reading a forensic engineering report that had arrived that afternoon from an external firm in Pittsburgh, and that the report's executive summary was 4 pages long, and that Evelyn Hart had read it twice without speaking. The forensic report confirmed what Miles's original safety filing had predicted. The vehicle's lane decision algorithm had a failure mode under specific conditions. Sustained precipitation above a certain rate combined with a particular road surface gradient that caused the system to misread lane boundaries and issue a correction command that overrode driver input. The failure was documented in 3 separate test scenarios. The likelihood of encountering triggering conditions on a public road, particularly in a northern city in November, was not negligible. It was not a theoretical edge case. It was a foreseeable failure in foreseeable conditions that had been known, at least in preliminary form, to a Hart biotech engineer named Miles Carter 8 years ago, and that had been filed and buried, and that had continued to exist in the software through multiple revision cycles, because the person responsible for addressing it had instead chosen to address the person who'd found it. Sandra read the summary out loud to Evelyn, not because Evelyn couldn't read, but because sometimes you needed to hear a thing in another person's voice to make it real. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "My accident," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. "The conditions matched the failure profile," Sandra said carefully. "We can't establish direct causation without the original vehicle's system logs, and those were... The incident investigation records indicate the onboard data module was damaged in the collision, but the profile matches." Evelyn looked at her hands. She had been doing a lot of that lately. Looking at her hands the way you look at something you're trying to understand from a new angle. "He knew," she said. "Miles knew what the software could do. He filed the report because he knew." "Yes," Sandra said. "And then Marsh buried the report, destroyed Miles' career, and 18 months later the same software is still running in production vehicles. That's what the timeline shows." Evelyn was quiet for another moment. Outside the window, February had finally made a tentative gesture towards something less unrelenting. The skylighter, the cold still present but less absolute. The kind of incremental shift that you could only see if you'd been watching from the same window long enough. "Get me everything we need to take this to federal investigators," she said. "The full package. Every document, every timestamp, every communication. I want it structured so that any federal prosecutor can pick it up and understand the chain within an hour." "That's going to take another week to compile properly," Sandra said. "Then we take a week," Evelyn said. "And Sandra, I want Miles Carter's termination record formally reviewed and reversed through the company's HR process before we hand anything to investigators. I want his name cleared through our own system first, not as a legal maneuver, because it's the right order to do things in." Sandra nodded and wrote something down. "And I need you to find out," Evelyn said, "whether Miles has an attorney. If he doesn't, I want the company to retain one for him, independently, someone who has no conflicting interests and whose only obligation is to Miles." Sandra looked up from her notes. "He doesn't know any of this is happening yet." "No," Evelyn said, "he doesn't." "You're going to have to tell him." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm going to tell him myself." She found him on a Wednesday afternoon in the East Wing, the same corridor where they'd spoken briefly in January, near the pneumatic tube station that he'd apparently been servicing again because there was a panel open in the wall and a diagnostic reader sitting on the floor beside his tool bag. He was kneeling in front of the open panel with his back to her, doing something that required 2 hands and his full attention, and for a moment she sat in the corridor and watched him work without announcing herself. She had thought about this moment for 3 weeks. She had rehearsed it and discarded the rehearsal and rehearsed it again and discarded that too, and what she'd arrived at, finally, was the understanding that there was no version of this conversation that wasn't going to be hard, and that preparing for it was less useful than simply being present for it, which was a thing she was still learning how to do. "Miles," she said. He turned, saw her, and straightened up in the way that people who work on the floor straighten up when they weren't expecting an audience. Not embarrassed, just recalibrating. He picked up the diagnostic reader and stood. "Ms. Hart," he said. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not here. Not like this. I need you to come to my suite when you're off shift. Tonight, if you can." He looked at her for a moment. His face did the thing it had been doing since January. The careful absence, the stillness of a man who had learned to hold his reactions in because reacting had cost him things. "What's this about?" he said. "I'll explain everything tonight," she said. "I promise." Something in his face shifted at the word promise. Not dramatically. It wasn't that kind of face, wasn't built for dramatic shifts. Just a small adjustment, a slight recalibration, like a signal that had been running at low frequency, suddenly picking up a cleaner channel. "I'm off at 6, he said. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded once and turned back to the open panel, and Evelyn wheeled herself back down the corridor toward the elevator, and her hands on the wheels were steady because she made them steady, which was different from them being steady on their own. He came at 6:15, still in his work shirt, because he hadn't wanted to take the time to change and he hadn't been sure the occasion called for it. And honestly, he hadn't known what the occasion called for because the whole thing felt so far outside the geometry of his daily life that he'd spent the 3 hours between their conversation and the end of his shift trying not to think about it, and succeeding only partially. Sandra Reeves was in the suite when he arrived, along with the 2 associates. Evelyn introduced them briefly and then said, "I want to walk you through what we found. All of it. I'm not going to summarize it. I'm going to show you the actual documents." Miles sat down in one of the chairs across from the coffee table where the documents were laid out in sequence, and he looked at the first one, and then the second, and then he stopped looking at them and looked at the table instead for a moment. "Keep going," he said. So Sandra walked him through it, all of it, the safety report, the communications between Marsh and the technology director, the fabricated transfer records, the NDA, the forensic report on the vehicle's software failure profile. 45 minutes, methodical, nothing softened, nothing rushed. Miles was quiet through most of it. He asked 3 questions. One about the metadata on the fabricated transfer records, one about the forensic methodology the Pittsburgh firm had used, one about the timeline of Marsh's communications. And each question was precise and technical and revealed, to anyone paying attention, the specific quality of a mind that had once been very good at exactly this kind of analysis and had not lost the ability even after 8 years of doing something else. When Sandra finished, the room was quiet. Miles looked at the window. Outside, the February evening had gone dark, the city lights doing their indifferent glitter against the sky. "The accident," he said, not looking at Evelyn. "The failure profile matches the conditions," Evelyn said. "We can't establish direct causation without the original vehicle data. But it matches," Miles said. "Yes." He was quiet again, a long quiet, the kind that had weight. "I filed that report because I ran the numbers," he said. "I'd been running them for 6 weeks. I knew the failure was there. I didn't know how to prove it without more testing, but I knew it was real. I filed it because—" He stopped, started again. "I filed it because people were going to drive those cars in the rain. That was the whole point of the project. People were going to drive them, and the software was going to fail under conditions that anyone who'd lived in this city for 1 November would have encountered inside of a week." "I know," Evelyn said. "And Marsh killed it in 4 days." 8 days, Sandra said quietly. "He took 4 days to build the complaint and 4 more to execute the termination." Miles let out a slow breath. It wasn't a sigh. It was more deliberate than that, more controlled, the breath of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and is only now letting a small portion of it out. 8 years, he said. He said it like he was just counting, just establishing the number. "Yes," Evelyn said. He finally looked at her. "You believed him." "I did," Evelyn said. She didn't apologize yet, not because she wasn't going to, but because she wanted to say it right and she hadn't gotten there yet. "I was 22 and he was someone I trusted more than I should have, and he handed me a story that explained everything in a way I could live with. So I lived with it." "I know," Miles said. And his voice, when he said it, was not generous. It wasn't warm, wasn't forgiving, wasn't the voice of a man who was ready to close the distance. But it was honest, and honest was enough for right now. "I know how he worked. He was good at it." He was very good at it, Evelyn said. Another silence. Miles looked at the documents on the table. Sandra and the associates had the good sense to be still. What happens now? Miles said. We submit the full package to federal investigators, Evelyn said. The communications archive, the forensic report, the fabricated evidence analysis, everything. Sandra has already been in contact with the appropriate agency off the record to understand the intake process. That moves forward this week. Marsh. He's currently on a trip to London for a board conference, Evelyn said. He doesn't know this is happening. I wanted it to be fully documented and in legal hands before he had any reason to suspect. When he comes back on Friday, I'm going to meet with him, and Sandra will be present, and I'm going to give him the opportunity to resign before the investigators reach out to him formally. He won't take it, Miles said. No, Evelyn said. I don't think he will either, but I'm going to offer it. Miles looked at her. Why? Because I'm not doing this for revenge, she said. I'm doing it because it's the thing that needs to be done, and I want to be able to say at every step that I did it correctly. He was quiet for a moment, then, and my termination record is being formally reviewed and reversed, Evelyn said. HR will process the correction this week. Your engineering credentials, we're working with the state licensing board to have them reinstated. Sandra has documentation of the coercive circumstances of the NDA, which will be formally voided. And we've retained an attorney for you, independently, with no obligation to Heart Biotech, whose job is only to represent your interests in all of this. Miles looked at his hands. He had large hands, the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, calloused at the base of the fingers, a small scar along the right thumb from something years ago. He looked at them the way Evelyn had been looking at her own hands lately, like something newly foreign and strangely familiar at the same time. I don't know what to say, he said. You don't have to say anything tonight, Evelyn said. I have one more thing to tell you, and then we can be done for tonight. He looked up. The Anonymous Rehabilitation Fund, she said. The hospital's financial office helped me trace the originating account. She paused, not for effect, because she genuinely needed a moment. 7 years, Miles. Every January. The muscles in his jaw moved. He didn't say anything. I didn't know, Evelyn said. I had no idea. The fund was structured so that's why it was structured that way, he said. Flat, simple, not proud, not performing the gesture retroactively, just explaining the mechanism. Why? She said. It came out smaller than she intended, more genuinely asking. He looked at the window again. Because you needed the treatments, he said, and I had enough to contribute something. That's all it was. That's not all it was, Evelyn said. I know, he said after a moment, but that's how I had to think about it. Otherwise, it was something I couldn't afford to feel. The room was very quiet. Sandra gathered some papers with the deliberateness of someone giving a conversation space without physically leaving it, and the associates studied their respective laptops, and Evelyn and Miles sat in the particular silence of two people who have said enough for one night and are only now beginning to feel the shape of everything that hasn't been said yet. Okay, Miles said finally. He stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. I'll talk to the attorney. The firm's name is Holloway and Park, Sandra said. I'll send the contact information to you directly. He nodded. He moved toward the door and then stopped with his hand on the door frame. Not dramatically, just the natural pause of someone who has remembered something or is deciding whether to say it. Ava's drawing, he said, without turning around. The building with roots. She made it after her first speech session here. I don't know if that means anything, but I thought about it a lot this last month. He went out. The door didn't quite close behind him. The latch on the rehabilitation suite doors had a slight misalignment that maintenance had been meaning to address, and the door swung almost shut and then rested an inch open, the way improperly latched things do. Evelyn could hear the corridor, the distant elevator, the ordinary sounds of a hospital at 7 in the evening, doing the work that hospitals do at 7 in the evening. She sat in her wheelchair in the middle of the room, with the documents spread on the coffee table and the February night beyond the window, and she put her face in her hands for a moment, just a moment. Not weeping, not breaking, just allowing herself a brief respite from the effort of holding her expression in the shape of competence. Then she straightened. Sandra, she said, let's finish preparing the investigator package. Gerald Marsh came back from London on a Friday morning, rested, apparently untroubled, carrying a gift bag from Heathrow that he'd picked up for his assistant. He arrived at his office in Hart Biotech's downtown headquarters at 10:15 and found Evelyn Hart's wheelchair parked in front of his desk. Sandra Reeves was to Evelyn's right. A man from the federal agency's preliminary intake office, not an agent yet, just an intake coordinator, the formal investigation had not yet officially commenced, was standing near the window reviewing his phone, present as a witness rather than a participant. Marsh stopped in the doorway. He was 61 years old, well-preserved in the way that men with money and the absence of physical consequence tend to be well-preserved, with the kind of assured bearing that 2 decades of boardroom authority deposits into a person's posture. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Sandra. He looked at the intake coordinator. He looked at the banker's boxes stacked along his office wall. Something passed across his face that Evelyn had never seen there before. It was brief, and he controlled it quickly, and what replaced it was a smile that didn't reach the parts of his face that smiles are supposed to reach. "Evelyn," he said, "I wasn't told you were coming in today." "I know," she said. "Sit down, Gerald." He sat. Not because she'd told him to, Evelyn understood. Gerald Marsh did not do things because women in wheelchairs told him to. He sat because he was calculating, and calculation required stillness, and he needed to understand the dimensions of what he was looking at before he decided which way to move. Evelyn opened the folder on her lap. "I'm going to give you a chance to say whatever you want to say before this becomes a formal proceeding," she said. "That's the only courtesy I'm extending. After that, Sandra will explain the document package and the investigator intake process, and you'll want to call your personal attorney before anyone leaves this room." Marsh looked at the folder. He looked at Evelyn. He took a slow breath. "The Carter situation," he said. "The Carter situation," Evelyn confirmed. A pause. He was still calculating. She could see it. The specific quality of a very intelligent person trying to find the angle from which the geometry might still work in their favor. "The evidence was real," he said finally. "The investigation was—" "Gerald," Evelyn said, and something in her voice stopped him. Not volume, not anger exactly, just a completeness, a finality. The voice of someone who has already been to every place in this conversation and knows where all of them lead. "I've read everything, every document, every communication, every timestamp. Sandra's team has had 3 weeks." He looked at the banker's boxes again. "The girl who trusted you," Evelyn said. "The 22-year-old who sat in your office and cried and believed everything you told her because she thought you were the person who understood the company better than anyone. She read everything. And she is sitting in front of you right now, and she is not that girl anymore." Marsh was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The software had commercial timelines. The project had investment commitments. One engineer's risk assessment, filed without context, without peer review, killed him," Evelyn said. "And then the software failed in November on a wet road, and I've been in a wheelchair for 14 months. She let that sit. So we're past the part where you explain the business reasoning, Gerald. That part is over." He looked at her hands. He looked at the folder. He looked at Sandra. "You said I could call my attorney," he said. "Yes," Sandra said. "You can call right now. We'll wait." He called. The conversation was short. When he hung up, he looked older than he had when he came through the door, which was the thing that happened when the calculation finally resolved into a number that didn't work. He did not resign. Miles had been right about that. He sat in his chair and said, "I won't be resigning," in the voice of a man who had decided that the only remaining option was to fight it out in the formal proceedings, which was his right and which Evelyn had expected. "I know," she said. She looked at him for one more moment, not with anger, not anymore, but with the particular and permanent disillusionment of seeing clearly what you'd been refusing to see for years. "Goodbye, Gerald." She wheeled herself out of the office. Sandra and the intake coordinator followed. In the hallway outside, Evelyn stopped for a moment, hands on her wheels, looking at the corporate art on the wall. Clean lines, optimistic geometry, the kind of art that offices purchase to communicate stability. She thought about a Thursday, a safety report filed at 9 in the morning, a response in under an hour. "Hold this. Don't circulate." She thought about Miles Carter at 24 years old, sitting across a desk from someone he trusted, being handed a document he didn't have the resources to fight, and signing it because the alternative was worse. She thought about 8 years. The weight of them. "Let's go," she said to Sandra, and moved toward the elevator. The formal investigation commenced 14 days later. The board meeting at which Evelyn presented the full scope of the investigation findings, and at which Gerald Marsh's advisory role was formally and unanimously terminated, lasted 3 hours. Miles Carter's name was spoken into the official record of Heart Biotech for the first time since his termination 8 years ago. Spoken clearly, by name, with every credential and every finding attached to it, in a room full of people who had the power to hear it and the obligation to do something with what they heard. Miles himself was not in the room. He was at Sterling Medical, replacing a control panel on the East Wing freight elevator. It was a Thursday. He finished the job at 4:30, ran his test sequence, and signed off on the work order. His phone buzzed as he was packing his tools. It was the attorney from Holloway and Park. He read the message standing in the service corridor with his tool bag at his feet and the elevator humming behind him, running clean, doing the straightforward and honest work of carrying things from one floor to another. He stood there for a long time before he moved. The message from Holloway and Park was not long. "Mr. Carter," the board vote was unanimous. "Your termination record has been formally reversed and expunged from Heart Biotech's HR system. Your engineering credentials reinstatement paperwork has been filed with the state licensing board and is expected to process within 30 days. The NDA has been voided. Please call our office at your earliest convenience to discuss next steps regarding civil remedies. R. Holloway." Miles read it 3 times in the service corridor, standing under the fluorescent lights with the freight elevator humming behind him. Then he put his phone in his chest pocket, picked up his tool bag, and walked to the locker room. He changed out of his uniform. He sat on the bench in front of his locker for a while, not doing anything in particular, just sitting with his hands on his knees in the specific stillness of a man trying to locate himself inside a piece of news that was too large to absorb standing up. 8 years. The number kept presenting itself to him the way certain numbers do. Not as information anymore, but as a physical thing, something with dimension and weight that he kept running his hands over and couldn't quite get the shape of. He thought about the morning he'd signed the NDA. The Heart Biotech legal office on the 14th floor, which had been very clean and very quiet, with a view of the city that he'd spent most of the meeting looking at, because looking at the city was easier than looking at the document. The attorney across the table explaining the terms in the specific flat register of someone who has explained the same terms many times and has no opinion about them. Gerald Marsh sitting to the attorney's left, not saying anything, just present the way a verdict is present, the way a wall is present, the way something immovable makes itself known by simply existing in the room while you try to find a way around it. He'd been 24. He hadn't had a personal attorney. He hadn't had anyone, actually. His parents were in Cleveland, and calling them to explain what was happening would have required him to explain what was happening, which would have required him to understand it, which he didn't, not fully, because understanding it fully would have meant accepting that someone had built an elaborate and deliberate lie around him and walked away clean. That had seemed at 24 like something that didn't happen, like something that required a category his experience hadn't given him yet. He'd signed because the alternative was a criminal proceeding that Marsh's attorneys had laid out in clinical and plausible detail, and because he'd been 24 and alone in a room on the 14th floor looking at a city that didn't know he existed, and because sometimes you sign things not because you've decided they're right, but because you've run out of the kind of energy that choosing requires. He hadn't told Evelyn. They'd already ended. She'd said what she'd said in the parking garage the week before, and he'd believed, in the strange disorientation of those days, that she already knew everything, that she'd been part of it somehow, or at least that she'd accepted Marsh's version without looking for another one, and that this amounted to the same thing. He'd been wrong about that. He understood that now. He'd been wrong, and she'd been wrong, and between their two wrongnesses, Gerald Marsh had built himself 8 comfortable years. Darnell came in for his overnight shift and stopped when he saw Miles on the bench. "You still here?" he said. "Yeah," Miles said. Darnell looked at him for a moment with the specific assessment of a man who has seen people sitting on benches in locker rooms in a lot of different states. "Good news or bad news?" he said. Miles thought about it. "Good," he said. "I think. I'm not sure I know how to tell yet." Darnell opened his locker, pulled out his uniform. "That's usually how the good ones work," he said. "Bad news comes in fast. Good news takes a while to settle." Yeah, Miles said. He got up. He went to catch his bus. He called Ava's babysitter, a teenager from the third floor named Priya, who watched Ava on late nights and who was reliable in the specific way of people who are paid reliably, and asked if she could stay an extra hour. Priya said yes. Miles walked for a while instead of going straight home, which was something he almost never did because walking without a destination felt like a luxury his daily schedule hadn't accommodated in years. He walked along the lakefront, which in March was cold and mostly empty, the water gray-green and restless, the sky doing its gradual early spring thing of staying light 1 minute later every day without you quite noticing until you look up and it's 5:30 and still not dark. He put his hands in his pockets and walked and tried to figure out what he felt. What he felt, mostly, was tired. Not the good tired of a long day of legitimate work, not the hollow tired of prolonged stress, just tired in the way that someone is tired after carrying something heavy over a long distance and having it finally taken from their hands. The relief is real, but the muscles don't know it yet. The body keeps bracing for a weight that's no longer there. He thought about calling his parents. He'd kept them at a careful distance from the specifics of his life for 8 years. They knew about Ava, had met her twice, knew about the maintenance job in the broad strokes, but the whole architecture of why he'd ended up there rather than somewhere else was a conversation he'd never quite managed to have. He told himself it was to protect them from worrying. He told himself a lot of things over 8 years that had varying degrees of accuracy. He didn't call them tonight. He'd call them soon. But tonight he just walked. When he got back to the apartment, Ava was asleep on the couch with Priya, both of them having apparently watched something on the tablet that had put Ava out mid-episode, her sketchbook open on her chest, a half-finished drawing of what looked like 2 tall buildings standing next to a smaller one. Priya extracted herself from the couch with practiced quiet. Miles paid her, signed thank you, which she'd learned from watching Ava, and then stood in the living room after she left and looked at his daughter asleep on the couch. She'd drawn roots again. Under all 3 buildings this time, intertwined underground where the surface couldn't see them. He carried her to bed without waking her and put the sketchbook on her nightstand and stood in the doorway for a long moment before going back to the kitchen to make himself tea that he didn't particularly want but needed to do something with his hands. Evelyn came to the apartment 12 days later. She called first, which Miles hadn't expected but which was the right thing to do, and she asked if she could come, and he'd said yes after a pause that was only partly about logistical consideration and mostly about everything else. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon, which was the only day that the building's elevator was reliably working. He'd told her this without irony, as practical information, and she'd received it the same way. The apartment was what it was. He hadn't cleaned it in any special way. He'd cleaned it in the way he cleaned it every Saturday, which was thorough by necessity because a 6-year-old's entropy required constant management, but he hadn't rearranged anything or put things away that he wouldn't normally put away, because doing so felt like a performance he didn't have the energy for and didn't think Evelyn would want anyway. There were Ava's drawings on the refrigerator, approximately 20 of them in various states of completion, held up by an assortment of mismatched magnets. There was a wooden block structure on the living room floor that Ava had been building for 3 days and that Miles had been navigating around with the careful respect you give to architecture in progress. There was a laundry basket on the couch that he moved to the bedroom before Evelyn arrived, not as a performance, but because that was where it belonged, and he'd just been lazy about it. Ava was at the kitchen table working on a drawing when Evelyn knocked. Miles wheeled Evelyn in. The doorway was wide enough, barely, and he'd measured it the night before without quite admitting to himself why. And Ava looked up from her drawing with the immediate total attention of a child who is genuinely curious about most things and filters very little. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at the wheelchair. She looked at Miles. She signed something quick at Miles that he translated without thinking. "Is she your friend?" He signed back, "Yes," which felt both true and incomplete, which was approximately the accurate state of things. Ava slid off her chair and walked directly to Evelyn. No hesitation, no performance of shyness, just the straight line that children draw between themselves and things they want to investigate. She stopped at the side of the wheelchair and looked up at Evelyn with the specific expression of someone conducting an assessment. Evelyn looked back at her. "Hi," she said. Ava signed something that Miles translated from the corner of his eye while he moved the laundry basket. "Your wheels are very big." Evelyn looked at Miles. What did she say? She says your wheels are very big, he said from the bedroom doorway. Something crossed Evelyn's face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. They are, she said to Ava. They help me go where I need to go. Ava considered this. Then she signed again, and Miles translated. Can I push you? Ava, he started. It's okay, Evelyn said. She looked at Ava. You can try. It takes some muscle. Ava went around to the back of the wheelchair with the purposefulness of someone who has been given a task and intends to execute it correctly. She put her small hands on the push handles and pushed with her whole body, and the chair moved approximately 6 inches, which was enough for Ava to make a face of profound satisfaction. She's stronger than she looks, Evelyn said. She comes by it honestly, Miles said, from the kitchen doorway now, and then was briefly annoyed at himself for saying it because it was exactly the kind of thing he'd told himself he wasn't given to. Ava abandoned the wheelchair to retrieve something from the living room, a wooden block, one of the larger ones from the structure on the floor, and presented it to Evelyn with the gravity of an offering. Evelyn accepted it with matching gravity, turning it over in her hands. She's building a city, Miles said. She's been at it since Tuesday. What city? She hasn't named it yet. I asked. She signed that it's not ready to have a name. Evelyn looked at the block in her hands. She looked at Ava, who had gone back to her drawing at the table, apparently satisfied with the wheelchair experiment and now returned to her primary occupation. She's something, Evelyn said quietly. Not performing the sentiment, just saying it plainly, like a fact she'd arrived at and wanted to record. Yeah, Miles said, she is. He made coffee. Real coffee, not the instant. He'd fixed the carafe finally with a replacement part that had taken 3 weeks to source because he'd been looking for the exact right one, rather than a substitute. And they sat at the kitchen table while Ava drew and the afternoon moved at its Saturday pace through the apartment's single south-facing window. It wasn't comfortable exactly. That would be the wrong word. But it was real, which was something Miles had come to value over comfortable, because comfortable was the thing you could construct out of avoidance, whereas real required both people to actually be there. How are you doing with it? Evelyn asked. Not how are you doing generally. Specifically with the information, with the board decision, with everything that had shifted in the past month. I'm still working on it, he said. The attorney has been helpful. Our Holloway turns out to be a woman named Rachel, who's about 5 feet tall, and sounds like she could take apart a deposition the way I take apart an HVAC unit. I feel okay about that part. And the other parts? He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. The licensing board reinstated my credentials last week, he said. I have an engineering license again. I haven't done anything with that yet. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel about it. You don't have to feel anything specific, Evelyn said. I know, he said. I keep telling myself that and then noticing I'm feeling things anyway. Like what? He thought about it honestly, which was harder than it sounded. Angry, he said, which I expected. And something else that I don't have a clean name for, like when you've been walking a certain route for so long that the path is worn in, and then someone tells you the road you were walking around is actually open, and you're supposed to just start walking differently. Your feet still know the old way. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I've been in a wheelchair for 14 months, she said. My physical therapist told me in week 3 that I needed to stop trying to walk in my head, that my body was adapting and my brain needed to catch up. I told her that was the most useless advice I'd ever received. Was it? No, she said. It just took me 8 more months to figure out how to follow it. Ava looked up from her drawing and signed something at Miles. He looked at it and then said, She wants to know if you're staying for dinner. Evelyn looked at Ava. I don't want to impose, she said. Ava signed again, more emphatically. Miles translated. She says it's not imposing, it's sharing, and those are different things. Evelyn's expression did the thing it had been doing more frequently in the past hour, the not-quite smile that kept arriving before she could manage it. Okay, she said to Ava, I'll stay for dinner. Ava nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully negotiated an outcome they considered obvious from the beginning and went back to her drawing. Miles made pasta, which was the kind of cooking he actually knew how to do, as opposed to the kind he performed on occasions he felt required performance. He stood at the stove and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table across from Ava, and at some point Evelyn picked up one of Ava's colored pencils and made a questioning gesture at the sketchbook, and Ava pushed it toward her immediately in the way kids share things with people they've decided to trust, which is nothing like the way adults share things and is considerably more efficient. Evelyn drew something in the corner of a blank page. Miles couldn't see what from the stove. Ava looked at it and then looked at Evelyn and signed something. "What did she say?" Evelyn asked. Miles glanced over. "She said you draw buildings like someone who knows what they're supposed to do." Evelyn looked at the drawing whatever it was, for a moment. "I used to study architecture," she said, "before biotech. I was going to design hospitals." Miles hadn't known that. He held that piece of information quietly while he stirred the pasta and didn't say anything, because it felt like something that had its own right to just exist in the room for a moment without being commented on. Ava signed again. Miles translated. "Why didn't you?" "The company needed me," Evelyn said, simply, without the elaboration that would have made it into a larger story. Ava considered this. Then she signed, "Buildings need people too." Miles kept his eyes on the pasta. After dinner, while Miles was washing up, Ava dragged a chair to the side of Evelyn's wheelchair and climbed up on it, which brought her to approximately Evelyn's eye level. She had her sketchbook in her lap. She opened it to the drawing she'd been working on all afternoon, the 3 buildings with the intertwined roots, and held it up for Evelyn to look at. Evelyn looked at it for a long time. Ava signed something slowly, making sure each sign was clear, in the way she signed when she wanted to be understood precisely. Miles had dried his hands on the dish towel and was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he translated as she went, his voice quiet. "Buildings fall sometimes, but good people build them stronger." Evelyn looked at the drawing. She looked at Ava. Her jaw was doing the specific thing jaws do when a person is holding their expression in place by concentration rather than ease. "Did you make that up?" Evelyn asked. Ava signed, "I figured it out." "From what?" Ava pointed at Miles, then at Evelyn, then at herself, then at the drawing. Miles didn't translate that. It didn't need translation. Evelyn looked at the drawing for another moment, and then she said, "Can I have this one?" Ava considered it with the seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to significant decisions. Then she tore it carefully from the sketchbook. She was very precise about tearing, always along the spiral edge, and handed it to Evelyn with both hands. Evelyn took it with both hands. She folded it once, carefully, and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, against her chest. She stayed until 8. Miles walked her to the elevator, the building's elevator, which was working tonight, and they stood in the hallway while they waited for it with the specific quality of 2 people who have things to say and are trying to find the architecture of saying them. "I want to ask you something," Evelyn said. "Okay," Miles said. "And I want you to be honest, not generous, not diplomatic." "All right." She looked at the elevator doors. "Do you blame me?" "For what happened?" "For believing him." Miles leaned against the wall. The elevator cable moved somewhere inside the shaft, the old building sounds doing their thing around them. "I blamed you for a long time," he said, which was honest. "In the first couple of years, yeah, I did. Not because you did anything, but because I needed someone to be in it with Marsh, and you were the most available candidate. And now? Now I know you were 22, and he was 60, and he'd been working on you since you were 19, Miles said. "So no, I don't blame you now, but I also can't pretend the 8 years didn't happen because they did, and we were both different people on the other side of them." "Different how?" He thought about it. "Harder," he said, "and maybe more honest about what matters. Which is, I don't know. Maybe that's what happens." The elevator arrived. The doors opened. Evelyn didn't move immediately. "Miles," she said. "Yeah. I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not as a legal statement, I'm not managing this conversation for an outcome. I'm sorry because you were 24 years old and you were doing the right thing, and it cost you everything that should have protected you from exactly that. I'm sorry I wasn't someone you could have called." He looked at her. Her face was very still and very present, the face of someone who has said the exact thing they intended to say and is now simply letting it be what it is. "I know," he said. "Thank you." She wheeled into the elevator, turned to face the hallway. "Ava's drawing," she said. "I'm going to keep it." "She'll be glad," he said. The doors closed. Miles stood in the hallway for a moment after the elevator descended, looking at the closed doors, listening to the cable and the counterweight doing their physics in the dark of the shaft. The building's pipes knocked once, the way they always did at this hour. He went back inside. Ava was in bed. He'd put her down before walking Evelyn out, but she wasn't asleep yet. He could tell by the quality of the quiet from her room, the absence of the specific deep breathing that sleep brought. He pushed her door open and leaned in the frame. She was on her back with her arms at her sides, looking at the ceiling, which was a thing she did when she was thinking. She signed without looking at him. "Is she coming back?" "I think so," Miles said, and signed it. Ava signed, "Good," and closed her eyes. Miles pulled her door mostly closed and went to the kitchen and poured the last of the coffee, which was cold now, and drank it anyway. He looked at the refrigerator, the drawings, the mismatched magnets, the grocery list in his handwriting along the left side, spinach underlined twice because he kept forgetting it. He thought about what Evelyn had said. "I'm sorry I wasn't someone you could have called." He thought about what it would have meant, at 24, to have had someone to call. The whole altered topology of a life built from that different starting point. He could run that calculation clearly. He was an engineer. He understood how initial conditions propagated through systems, how one changed variable cascaded through everything downstream. But here was the thing about that calculation. It didn't produce Ava. The specific Ava who drew buildings with roots and negotiated dinner invitations with the calm authority of a diplomat and had handed her best drawing to a stranger she'd met 2 hours ago because she'd decided the stranger needed it more than she did. That Ava was the product of exactly these 8 years, these specific ones, with their specific losses and specific adjustments and specific nights on the kitchen floor of this apartment on Kellner Street, working out the arithmetic of keeping one small person afloat. He wasn't grateful for what had happened. He wasn't going to perform gratitude for Gerald Marsh or for the 8 wasted years or for the thing that had put Evelyn in a wheelchair. He wasn't built for that kind of retroactive reconciliation with suffering, and he didn't trust the people who were. But he could hold 2 things at once: the wrongness of what had been done, which was real, and which would go through a federal process and come out the other side as whatever it came out as, and the fact that his daughter existed in the exact form she existed in, which was the most irreducible good thing in his life. He rinsed his mug. He turned off the kitchen light. In the living room, Ava's block city sat on the floor in the dark, 3 buildings of different heights, with their foundations touching, waiting for a name it wasn't ready to have yet. The weeks after Evelyn's visit settled into something that didn't have a clean category. Not a courtship, not a reconciliation, not a friendship in the ordinary sense of the word. Something that was its own specific thing, assembled from their particular history and their particular present, and that required them to make up the rules as they went, because no existing template quite fit. Evelyn came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. She didn't announce it as a pattern, neither of them did, but it became one the way things become patterns when 2 people keep choosing the same thing without discussing whether they're choosing it. She learned Ava's signs the way she learned everything, methodically, with complete commitment, carrying a small notebook where she wrote the hand shapes in a shorthand she'd developed for herself. Within 3 weeks, she could hold a basic conversation with Ava without Miles as intermediary, which Ava received with the specific delight of a child who has been given a new person to communicate directly with. Within 5 weeks, she was attending Ava's Tuesday speech sessions, not as an observer, Dr. Kowalski had clarified gently, but as a participant, because Ava worked harder when someone she cared about was in the room and watching. Miles watched all of this from the careful distance of a man who had learned not to want things too fast, because wanting things too fast was a way of losing them before they had the chance to become real. He was also, in a parallel track, trying to figure out what his engineering license meant now that it existed again. Rachel Holloway had been clear in their second meeting. The civil remedies available to him were significant. 8 years of suppressed career trajectory, documented through the archived safety report and the fabricated termination evidence, translated into numbers that Miles had difficulty looking at directly, because they represented something he hadn't been able to imagine having, and that still felt like someone else's mathematics. "You don't have to decide anything quickly," Rachel had said. "The civil process will take time regardless, but I want you to start thinking about what you want, not just what you'll accept." He thought about it on his bus rides. He thought about it during the straightforward, honest work of maintenance shifts, tracing circuits, replacing panels, fixing the things that needed fixing. He thought about it sitting on the floor of Ava's room after she fell asleep, watching her breathe. He didn't want to go backward. That was the thing he kept arriving at, from different angles, through different paths of thinking. He didn't want to reconstruct the life that had been taken from him. The 24-year-old's version of it, the one where he was an engineer at Heart Biotech, and he and Evelyn were building towards something, and Gerald Marsh was a mentor rather than the thing he'd turned out to be. That life was gone, and the person who'd been going to live it was also, in some meaningful sense, gone, replaced by someone older and more specific and less willing to accept summaries instead of documents. What he wanted, when he got honest about it, was something that used what he actually knew. 8 years of keeping systems running in a hospital. 8 years of understanding, from the inside, what broke and why, and what the gap was between the safety standards on paper and the safety reality on the ground. 8 years of watching what happened when equipment failed in places where failure had consequences. Real ones, immediate ones, measured in human terms rather than liability terms. He didn't have a name for what that looked like as a job, but he was starting to think Evelyn might. He hadn't said this to her yet. He was still turning it over. On the fourth Saturday that Evelyn came to the apartment, Ava showed her the finished city. She'd named it that morning, had come to breakfast with the announcement ready, signing it before Miles had poured her juice. It has a name now. What's the name? He'd asked. She'd signed a word he didn't immediately recognize. He'd asked her to spell it. She'd spelled it out, letter by letter, with the focused care she brought to spelling, Forward. He'd looked at the block city on the floor. 3 buildings, different heights, foundations touching, roots intertwined in the drawing she'd made of them. Forward. Yeah, he'd said. That works. When Evelyn arrived that afternoon, Ava took her hand and led her to the living room and gestured at the city with the pride of a person presenting something they'd been building toward for longer than the construction itself had taken. Evelyn looked at it for a long time. What's it called? She asked. Ava signed the word. Evelyn had enough vocabulary now to read it without Miles. She looked at the city. She looked at Ava. Her hand was still in Ava's hand. She hadn't let go. Perfect, she said. Miles was in the kitchen doorway, watching the two of them in front of the block city, and he felt something move through his chest that he'd spent 8 years learning not to feel, because feeling it had always before been followed immediately by losing whatever had caused it. He let himself feel it anyway. He was still working on that, on letting himself believe that good things could stay. He wasn't finished working on it. He wasn't sure he'd be finished for a while. But Ava was signing something to Evelyn, and Evelyn was signing something back with her small notebook vocabulary and her careful hands, and the block city named Forward sat on the living room floor in the Saturday afternoon light, and Miles Carter leaned against the kitchen doorframe and watched the two people he loved most in the world talking to each other in a language built from nothing but the movement of hands. The federal investigation into Gerald Marsh took 7 months. Miles knew this not because anyone kept him closely briefed. Rachel Holloway passed along procedural updates when they were relevant to his civil case, and Sandra Reeves sent a formal communication when each milestone cleared, but because 7 months was how long it took before the news became public. And when it did, it came out the way these things always come out, all at once, in a Tuesday morning headline that Miles read on his phone on the 6:10 bus while Ava sat beside him with her forehead against the window, watching the city go past. The headline said, Heart Biotech executive charged in 8-year cover-up of fatal safety defect, former engineer cleared. He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and looked at the back of the seat in front of him for a while. Ava tugged his sleeve. She signed, What's wrong? He signed back, Nothing's wrong. And then, because she was 7 now, and her capacity for detecting incomplete truths had only sharpened with age, something ended today. That's all. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Then she signed, Is it the bad thing? He looked at her. He hadn't told her the full story. She was 7. There would be time. There would be a version of the telling that was appropriate to who she was when she was ready to hear it. But children absorb the emotional weather of the adults around them with an accuracy that has nothing to do with what they've been told explicitly, and Ava had known for months that something large was moving through her father's life, the way you know a storm is coming before you can see it. Yes, he signed. The bad thing ended. She nodded once, satisfied, and turned back to the window. The bus moved through the morning city, and Miles sat with the specific and unperformable feeling of a man who has waited a long time for something and is now in the strange quiet on the other side of the wait. Not triumphant, not healed, just arrived. Standing in a place he'd been walking toward for 8 years without always believing he'd get there, and finding that arrival looked less like a destination and more like a clearing. A place where you could finally see what was actually around you because the thing you'd been watching for wasn't blocking the view anymore. Gerald Marsh was charged with fraud, obstruction, falsification of evidence, and criminal negligence in connection with the vehicle safety defect. His attorneys, as Rachel had predicted, mounted a vigorous defense. Miles did not follow the proceedings closely. He had enough information to know that the case was solid, that the federal investigators had built it carefully and thoroughly, and that Rachel's assessment of the civil outcome was conservative in the way of attorneys who prefer to underpromise. Beyond that, he had made a deliberate choice to let the legal system do what the legal system did without spending his daily energy watching it do it. He'd spent 8 years carrying what Marsh had done. He wasn't willing to spend the next year carrying it in a different way. What he spent his energy on instead was the conversation he'd been turning over since March. He had it with Evelyn on a Wednesday evening in late April at the apartment, after Ava was in bed. It was raining outside, a slow, determined spring rain that came down without drama and accumulated quietly on the windowsills. Evelyn had started staying later on weeknights, which had happened incrementally enough that neither of them had formally acknowledged it as a changed pattern, which was how they both seemed to prefer things, changes that established themselves through repetition rather than announcement. Miles made tea. He sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table and wrapped his hands around his mug the way he always did and said, "I want to talk to you about something." "Okay," she said. "It's about the company." She looked at him with the careful stillness that meant she was listening fully, without the part of her that was simultaneously managing something else. "I've been thinking about what I actually know how to do," he said. "Not in the credential sense. In the 8 years of watching systems fail sense. Medical equipment, building systems, hospital infrastructure. I know where the gap is between safety standards written on paper and safety reality on the ground. I know what that gap costs, in the specific places where it costs it immediately, and I don't think—" He stopped. Reorganized. I don't think there are enough people in product development at the level where that gap gets caught before it becomes a filing someone buries. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about a safety function," she said. "I'm talking about a safety function that's actually embedded in development," he said. "Not compliance review after the fact. Not a checklist that a team runs before launch. Something earlier. Someone whose job is specifically to think about failure modes from the intent, from the engineering, before the product gets far enough along that fixing it threatens a timeline." "That's not a standard role," Evelyn said. "I know. I'd have to build the position around whoever was doing it." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Are you telling me you want the job, or are you telling me the job should exist?" He thought about it. "Both," he said. "I think they're the same thing in this case." Evelyn looked at her tea. The rain came down on the windowsill. From down the hall, the specific silence of Ava sleeping that Miles had learned to distinguish from all other kinds of silence. "You'd be giving up the seniority you've built at Sterling," Evelyn said. "I'd be giving up a maintenance job," Miles said. Not sharply, just accurately. "You'd be back inside a corporate structure, after everything that happened inside one." "I'd be back inside your corporate structure," he said. "Which is different. Not because I trust it automatically. I don't trust anything automatically. That's one of the things I learned. But because I know what you're building now, and I know why. And I think I'm more useful there than I am replacing HVAC capacitors." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. The look wasn't calculation exactly. She wasn't running the numbers, wasn't managing the conversation toward an outcome. It was the look of someone checking whether what they were hearing matched what they needed it to be. "I'm not offering you this because of what happened," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to compensate for—" "Evelyn," he said. "I know. That's not what this is." A pause. The rain. "Okay," she said. "Then let's talk about what the role actually looks like." They talked until 11:30 at the kitchen table in the rain, and it was one of the more useful conversations Miles had had in recent memory. Practical, specific, argumentative in the good way where both people are trying to get to the accurate answer rather than the comfortable one. Evelyn pushed back on two of his structural proposals and was right both times, which he acknowledged without difficulty because being right mattered more to him than being unchallenged. He pushed back on her timeline and was right about that, which she acknowledged with the specific grace of someone who has learned, through sustained effort, to receive correction without treating it as an attack. It wasn't a perfect conversation. Miles said something in the middle of it that came out more pointed than he'd intended, about the ways corporate safety culture creates incentives for documentation over actual safety, and Evelyn's jaw tightened for a moment in a way that meant the point had landed close to something personal. He didn't walk it back, it was true, but he said, after a beat, "That's not directed at you," and she said, "I know, but it still lands," which was honest, and they both let it sit there and continued. At 11:30. Evelyn said she should go, and Miles walked her to the elevator, and they stood in the hallway the way they'd been standing in hallways together since January of the previous year, with the particular accumulated weight of everything that had been said in hallways and everything that hadn't. "Miles," Evelyn said. "Yeah." She looked at the elevator doors, then at him. "I'm not good at this part," she said. "What part?" "The part where I say things that aren't about logistics." He leaned against the wall. "I know," he said. "You get a specific look when you're about to try." "What kind of look?" "Like you're doing structural calculations," he said. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and was also exactly a smile. "I've been in love with you since I was 22 years old," she said. "I've done everything I could to not be for various reasons, for various periods of time. I'm done doing that. I wanted to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain." The elevator cable moved in the shaft. The building settled around them. "I've been in love with you the whole time too," Miles said. "I just didn't have anywhere to put it for 8 years. And now? Now I have somewhere to put it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them moved to make it into something more than what it was right now, which was two people standing in a hallway telling each other true things at 11:30 on a rainy Wednesday, which was already more than either of them had believed they'd get, and which was therefore exactly enough. The elevator arrived. She went in. The doors closed. Miles stood in the hallway until he heard the elevator reach the ground floor, and then he went back inside to his daughter and his kitchen and the rain on the windowsill and the block city named Forward that Ava had rebuilt twice since its original construction, each time taller and more specific than before. 6 months after that conversation, Miles Carter began his first day as Director of Safety Innovation at Heart Biotech. He wore a button-down shirt that he'd bought specifically for the occasion and then worried about for 3 days because it felt like a performance, and then stopped worrying about because Ava had told him, in signs, that he looked like himself but in a better shirt, which was the most accurate description of the goal he could have hoped for. He drove. He had a car now, a used one, reliable, nothing remarkable. And he parked in the Heart Biotech garage and took the elevator to the 6th floor, which housed the product development division, and he stood in front of his office door for a moment before going in. The office was small. He'd asked for small, had specifically declined the larger one Evelyn's assistant had offered, because a large office felt like a statement he wasn't ready to make, and a small one felt like a place where actual work happened. It had a window that looked out over the city, which was a thing he hadn't had in 8 years, and which he found he needed a moment to just acknowledge before he sat down. The city. The same city he'd been looking at from bus windows and hospital corridors for a decade, from the angle of someone moving through it at ground level. From here it looked different. Not better, not more important, just different. The same buildings from a different floor. He sat down. He opened his laptop. He started reading the product development files that his assistant had compiled. 18 active projects in various stages, ranging from early-stage research to pre-launch review. He read them the way he read everything, looking for the seams, the places where the summary and the underlying data didn't quite align, the questions that weren't being asked because asking them would complicate a timeline. He found 3 in the first morning. He wrote them up, carefully, in the specific format he'd developed during the weeks he and Evelyn had spent building the role. Not as complaints, not as flags that would trigger defensive responses, but as engineering questions with specific answers required before the next stage could proceed. He sent them to the relevant project leads with a covering note that explained who he was and what his function was and what he needed from them. 2 of the 3 responded within the hour. The third took until the next morning, and the response had a defensive edge that Miles noted without reacting to, because changing culture was a longer game than changing a control panel, and he'd known that going in. He was not naive about what he'd stepped into. Hart Biotech was not a different company because Evelyn Hart had committed it to a different direction. It was the same company with the same accumulated habits and incentive structures and people who had spent years learning to operate within systems that rewarded the wrong things. Changing that was the kind of work that took years and produced friction and sometimes failed entirely. He knew this. He'd watched systems behave for 8 years, and he understood that the humans inside them were also systems, running their own logic, responding to their own pressures. But he also understood something he hadn't had language for at 24, that the person doing the work of finding the failure before it became the failure was not a problem for the system. They were the thing that made the system worth having. And if the system couldn't accommodate that, if the company couldn't accommodate an engineer whose only agenda was that the products worked safely before they went into the world, then the company would eventually fail in some way that nobody would be able to say they hadn't been warned about. He wasn't going to let that happen. That was the job. That was the entire job. Evelyn announced the company's new strategic mission at the annual stakeholder conference in September. A full auditorium, live-streamed, the board seated in the front row in the specific posture of people who have been briefed and have decided to be visibly aligned. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, which was a thing she'd always been able to do, and that still, according to Tom, made her communications team nervous every time. Miles watched from the back of the room. He'd told her he'd sit in the front with the other department heads, and she'd said, "You don't have to, you know?" And he'd said, "I know," and he'd sat in the back anyway, which was where he thought better and where he could see the room. She talked about the company's history, not the sanitized version, not the version that skipped the past 2 years and presented Hart Biotech as a smoothly evolving institution. The real version, with the weight of what had happened given its actual weight, acknowledged without performance. She talked about Gerald Marsh in the specific way of someone who has processed their disillusionment fully enough to speak of it plainly. She talked about Miles' safety report, by name specifically, in a room of 300 people, and what it had documented, and what had been done with it, and what that had cost. Then she talked about where the company was going, the new mobility technology initiative, the accessible hearing device program, which was already in pilot with 6 pediatric audiology clinics across 4 states, the paralysis research partnership with 3 university medical centers that was funding the kind of work that didn't get funded when profit margins were the primary filter. The reorganized safety function embedded in development rather than bolted on at the end, with teeth and authority, and a director who reported directly to the CEO and whose assessments could not be routed to a subdirectory labeled resolved. The question I've been asked most often in the past year, Evelyn said, is whether I think the company can actually change, whether a company that did what this one did can genuinely become something different, or whether the change is surface, good PR, careful positioning, a new coat of paint on the same structure. The room was very quiet. "I don't have a comfortable answer to that," she said. "What I have is this. I think companies are made of decisions, accumulated over time, and the decisions we make from here are the ones that will determine what this company actually is. Not what happened before, not what we say we are, what we do, repeatedly, over time. When it's inconvenient." She looked at the room. "I intend to make the right decisions," she said, "and I have hired people who will tell me directly and without softening it when I'm not." In the back of the room, Miles looked at his hands. He thought about a Thursday morning 8 years ago, a safety report filed at 9 a.m., the clean and simple act of writing down what he knew to be true and submitting it to the people who were supposed to do something with it. He thought about how little it had cost him to do the right thing in the moment of doing it. How easy it was, actually, to write down what was true when you were still young enough to believe that the truth, once written, would be received as truth. He thought about what it had cost him afterward. He didn't think what he'd done was heroic. He thought it was the minimum. And he thought, sitting in the back of an auditorium, watching the woman he loved tell 300 people the truth about what her company had done wrong, that the minimum was underrated, that most of the damage done in the world was done not by people who actively chose to cause harm, but by people who chose, at the critical moment, to not write down what they knew was true, to route it to resolved, to stay quiet, because staying quiet was cheaper. He'd been 24. He'd been alone in a room on the 14th floor. He'd been afraid. He'd written it down anyway. He still didn't know exactly what that had cost him. The civil settlement, finalized 6 weeks ago, after 9 months of proceedings, had produced a number that his brain still did something sideways around when he looked directly at it. Rachel had described it as appropriate, which from Rachel meant significant. He'd taken a portion of it and set it in a fund for Ava. Education, hearing technology, whatever she needed, a floor under her future that he hadn't been able to build from a maintenance salary, no matter how carefully he'd calculated. He'd taken another portion and discussed it with Evelyn and contributed it to the Mobility Research Partnership, anonymously, because that was how he preferred to do things of that kind, and because it felt like completing a circuit that had been open for too long. The rest he was still figuring out. He was not accustomed to having resources. He was going to be careful with them, and patient, and he was going to get it wrong in some ways and right in others, and that was acceptable. The lakeside park on the Sunday after the conference was Ava's idea. She had been lobbying for it since Thursday, had made her case each morning with the methodical persistence of someone who understood that repeated, well-reasoned requests were more effective than a single dramatic one. Miles suspected she'd learned this from watching Evelyn negotiate, which was both impressive and slightly alarming as a developmental observation. It was a good October day, the kind that October produces occasionally and without warning, as if compensating for the gray it was about to deliver for the next 5 months. The sky was genuinely blue, the lake doing its best impression of something benevolent, the trees along the path in the specific orange gold that only exists for about 10 days a year before it becomes brown, and then nothing. Miles pushed Evelyn's wheelchair along the lakeside path, which was paved and wide enough for the chair without difficulty. He'd pushed it before. It had become a natural thing, in the way that the accommodations of life with someone become natural through repetition until they stop being accommodations and become just the texture of daily existence. Evelyn had her jacket on and her tablet in her lap, though she wasn't working. The tablet was there the way a book is there for someone who finds security in the proximity of something to do, even when they're not doing it. Ava was ahead of them on the path, which was where Ava was most comfortable. At the edge of what was visible, far enough ahead to feel the independence of her own momentum, close enough that Miles was never more than a 10-second run away. She had a small bag over her shoulder with her sketchbook in it. She was practicing her spoken words as she walked, the way Dr. Kowalski had shown her, mouthing them, sometimes voicing them. The sounds not always clean but present, genuinely present, more of them every month. The upgraded hearing technology had made a difference that Miles still hadn't found adequate language to describe. Not a cure. He had stopped early in Ava's life thinking about it in cure-shaped terms, which had been one of the more useful adjustments he'd made, but an opening, a wider channel. More of the world's sound getting through to her in a form she could work with. Dr. Kowalski had said in their last session that Ava was performing 6 months ahead of where she'd projected, which Dr. Kowalski had said in the careful, calibrated way of someone who didn't want to set unrealistic expectations, and which Miles had received with equal care, and which he'd nonetheless sat with in the parking lot afterward for 5 minutes before he could drive. Evelyn had cried when she heard that. She'd been on the phone with Miles when he called to tell her, and she hadn't tried to manage it, which was how Miles knew how much it mattered to her. Evelyn Hart managed most things, and the ones she didn't manage were the real ones. The funding for the hearing device program had come partly from the company's new initiative budget and partly from a private foundation that Evelyn had established separately, structured so that it operated independently of Hart Biotech's commercial interests and couldn't be redirected if the company's priorities shifted. She'd done this without announcing it. Miles had found out through Tom, who had mentioned it in passing as though it were an administrative detail, which was either Tom being discreet or Tom genuinely not understanding what he'd described. Miles had not brought it up with Evelyn directly. He'd filed it in the category of things he knew about her that he didn't need to discuss, because some things communicated themselves more clearly through action than conversation, and this was one of them. They walked. Miles pushed. Ava ranged ahead. and the October day did its generous thing around them. Somewhere on the lake, a small boat moved slowly, and the trees dropped their leaves in ones and twos. The way leaves drop when there's no wind, as if each one had individually decided the time was right. Evelyn said, without looking up from the tablet she wasn't using, "I've been thinking about the paralysis research program." "What about it?" Miles said. "The university partnership is going well, better than projected. Dr. Amara's team in particular, they've had a preliminary result on the nerve pathway stimulation work that I want to accelerate funding for." "Okay. That's going to require a board decision on budget reallocation," she said. "I'm not worried about the vote. I'm thinking about the structure. Whether we set it up as a direct grant or bring the university team in as a formal research partner." "What does Amara want?" Miles said. "Partnership," Evelyn said. "She's been clear about that." "Then that's your answer," Miles said. "She's doing the work. Give her the structure that lets her control how she does it." Evelyn looked at the lake. "That's what I thought," she said. "I just wanted to hear you say it." "You didn't need me to say it." "No," she agreed, "but I wanted to." Miles had been thinking lately about what it meant to need something versus want it, the difference between the two, which he'd spent most of his adult life collapsing into the same category because need was defensible and want was not. Need was the arithmetic of survival, and want was a luxury for people whose arithmetic was already solved. He was slowly, imperfectly, learning to maintain the distinction. To say "I want this" without immediately converting it into something more justifiable. It was harder than it sounded. 8 years of very specific conditioning did not unwind in 6 months, or 12, or probably 20. But he was working on it. He wanted this. This specific day, this path, this woman in this chair, this child ranging ahead of them both. He wanted it without justification, without converting it into something more defensible. He just wanted it because it was good, and it was his, and he had worked very hard for a very long time in the specific way of people who work hard without being certain. "There's anything on the other side of it?" Ava stopped ahead on the path. She turned around and looked back at them, and even at the distance, Miles could read her expression. Not the expression of a child who has seen something alarming, or who has decided she's gone far enough and is waiting to be caught up to. Something else. She looked at both of them with the particular focus she brought to things she was about to say that she'd been thinking about for a while. She waited until they reached her. Then she reached out and took one of Miles's hands and one of Evelyn's and held them both, one on each side of her. She was not quite tall enough that the geometry worked perfectly, one arm stretching up slightly toward Miles, the other at a different angle toward Evelyn's chair. And she didn't try to fix the geometry. She just held on and looked at the lake for a moment, and then signed with both hands simultaneously the way she sometimes did when she needed to talk with her hands full. She released their hands briefly to sign it cleanly. "Now we're all moving forward together." Then she took their hands again. Miles looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was looking at Ava, and there were tears on her face that she wasn't doing anything about, which was how Miles knew she'd decided not to manage this one. She looked up at him, and he saw in her face the specific expression of someone who has been through enough that beauty, when it arrives, lands with the full weight of everything it took to get there. He didn't say anything. Some things were exact enough that language would only move them sideways. He held Ava's hand. Evelyn held Ava's other hand. The three of them stood on the lakeside path in the October light, and the leaves came down in ones and twos around them, and the lake moved at its own ancient pace, and Ava looked out at the water with the satisfied expression of someone who has arranged things correctly. There is a particular cruelty in the way certain losses announce themselves, not with violence but with bureaucratic efficiency, with the quiet routing of a document to a subdirectory with 8 words in an email. "Hold this, don't circulate, I'll be in touch." The damage done this way doesn't look like damage at first. It looks like a personnel matter, a clean termination, an engineer who turned out to be the wrong kind of person. And by the time you understand what actually happened, you're standing in a parking garage telling someone you never want to see them again. And they're signing a document on the 14th floor, and the years are already beginning their accumulation between you. But here's what Miles Carter had learned in the specific school of his specific life. The truth has a filing system of its own. It is slower than the systems built to suppress it. It requires people who are willing to look where they've been told there's nothing to see. It requires someone like Evelyn, reading archive files at 2 in the morning because something in her couldn't leave it alone. It requires the kind of stubborn, unspectacular fidelity to what is real that doesn't make for a good story while it's happening, but makes for the only story worth telling once it's done. It doesn't always work out. He knew that. He'd known people who'd written down the truth and watched it disappear without consequence, who'd waited for a clearing that never came. There was nothing guaranteed in the act of doing the right thing. The universe did not run on a moral ledger where every correct entry eventually balanced. He had no simple comfort to offer on that score, and he didn't trust the people who did. What he had instead was this. One morning, a wrong elevator. A set of doors opening on a floor he'd never had reason to visit. Two people looking at each other across 8 years of accumulated damage, neither of them whole, neither of them finished, both of them still here. Still here was not nothing. Still here was, in fact, the entire thing. Ava had released their hands and was running ahead again on the path, not away from them, just forward, in the direction of the next thing, whatever it turned out to be. Her voice carried back on the clean October air. Not words, just sound. The sound of a child moving fast through a good day, practicing being in the world. Miles pushed Evelyn's wheelchair forward along the path. Evelyn put her tablet in her bag. They followed Ava toward the next bend in the path, which they couldn't see around yet, which was fine. They had learned, both of them, the specific and necessary skill of moving toward things you can't fully see yet. Not because you're certain of what's there, because you've decided that the person next to you is worth the walk. The lake went on being the lake. The trees went on dropping their leaves. The city sat behind them, doing its endless and indifferent work, full of elevators and corridors and documents filed and buried and eventually found. Full of people carrying things they were trying to put down, full of ordinary Thursdays that turned out to matter more than anyone could have predicted when they started. And Miles Carter, who had once been a man who held himself still as a practice of survival, moved forward, simply.